AWS Elastic Compute Cloud. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, I want to give you a brief introduction to AWS's infrastructure as a service known as EC2, or Elastic Compute Cloud. First, I want to talk about briefly what an infrastructure as a service is. What makes it so cool that you've got EC2 instances or virtual machines that you can spin up on AWS infrastructure. Then we'll talk about how you price and configure your EC2 instances, pay-as-you-go pricing model, and why that's so efficient and effective for organizations both large and small. And lastly, we'll look at AMIs, Amazon Machine Images, which are the images that you configure your virtual machines from. When you get started with Amazon Web Services, one of the easiest features to get your head around is going to be their Elastic Compute Cloud, also known as EC2. And the reason for that is EC2 is virtual machines in the cloud. That's all it is. It's just virtual machines that you spin up on Amazon's infrastructure. We call this Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS. I mentioned in a different nugget that we're going to talk about this as a service phrase a lot. Well, this is the first time that we come across it, and anytime you're standing up virtual machines in a cloud, regardless of whether or not it's on Amazon or not, we tend to think of this as infrastructure as a service. And what that means is that the entire infrastructure is provided to you as a fully managed service. So if you think about all of the hardware and infrastructure that goes behind a virtual machine, you need the computers, the hard drives, the networking equipment, the racks. You need the physical space in a data center. There's got to be good air conditioning, cooling going on. You got to have good clean power coming in. You've got to have physical security. The doors have to be locked, and you need, cameras watching those doors and security guards. All of that stuff is taken care of by Amazon. You don't have to worry about or set up or maintain or pay for any of that. It's all fully managed. All of that infrastructure is delivered to you as a service. And when you want to stand up a virtual machine on this service, it's really, really easy to do. In fact, you get to do it through software if you want. We'll be doing it in a couple of nuggets through the management console, through the web interface, but you could very easily write software to do this all for you and automate the entire process. So EC2 has a number of different features. Just to highlight some of the big ones, well, yeah, they're custom virtual machines. That means once you've got this virtual machine spun up, it's got an operating system on it, you can connect to it and install anything you want. You need to run SQL Server, you can install SQL Server. You got your own product or your own software that you want to run on it, you can do that too. This is all, like I mentioned, a fully managed infrastructure, so you don't have to worry about any of the uptime or any of the hardware that goes in underneath. It's also really, really fast. You can provision new servers in minutes. I don't know about you, but when I was working in an enterprise environment and I needed a new virtual machine in order to run some software on, it could take weeks to get that virtual machine back from the IT team. Not because they were, slow or incompetent, but simply because they were overwhelmed with work, and we had to make sure that it fit all the different standards and practices of our organization. Well, on EC2 and Amazon Web Services, it really only takes a couple of minutes for your virtual machine to spin up. You've also got elastic scaling. We talked about this a little bit in another nugget, and you can spin up and spin down virtual machines even dynamically with the auto load balancer as needed to respond to the traffic that changes on your system. You can use pre-built images with operating systems. We're going to talk about those momentarily. Or you can bring your own images. So you can build an image in your own local data center, turn it into what's called an AMI, an Amazon Machine Image, and then use that to spawn new EC2 instances, new virtual machines. You've also got fully configurable network operations, and we're going to dig into the network operations a whole bunch later in this series, but you can really define neat network parameters to group your machines together into subnets and control with firewall rules what can and cannot be communicated between all these things. Now, one of the most beneficial features of doing this, as opposed to spinning up virtual machines on your own private infrastructure in your own private cloud, is that EC2 instances, IaaS, means pay as you go. So there are a number of different flexible payment options for EC2 instances. We're going to talk about some of those more in depth in a later nugget. You've got things like pay as you go. You can also reserve or schedule instances, schedule payments, and those are ways to make this even cheaper than it already is, and I promise you it's already very, very cheap. But pay as you go is really the ideal way to get started, to get ramped up on EC2. Pay as you go means, like it sounds, that you only pay for machines that are in a running state as you need them. So you can actually spin up a whole bunch of machines, and until they are up and running, you're not paying for them. Now, once they're running, if you need to save costs, you can stop those machines. You can turn off a virtual machine, and you're no longer paying for that virtual machine until you start it back up again. Once it becomes running again, then you begin paying for it again. And pricing is hourly when you pay as you go, with the note that partial hours count as full. So if you have a machine running for 2 hours and 15 minutes, that'll cost you 3 hours of machine time. But paying for it hourly means that whenever you need to shut down or turn off these machines to save cost, you can do so very easily. This is where the elastic part comes in. These are very elastic, very scalable, so that you don't have to pay for any more than you actually need to run your software implementation. Creating these new virtual machine instances is so easy to do, and we are going to go ahead and do this in a later nugget. We'll actually walk through the process. You'll be able to follow along if you just open up a web browser. But it breaks down into 4 basic steps. 1, you need to choose your region and availability zone. So you can build your EC2 instances in any region. If you know that your users need to connect to your EC2 instances from the west coast of the United States, well, build those EC2 instances in the Western region data center. If you've got users in Europe, put it out in the European data center. There's a data center in Tokyo if you have users in Japan or Eastern Asia. So you can choose the region that's going to be geographically closest to the people who need to connect to that instance the most, and that's going to help you reduce latency and reduce lag for those users. You can also spin up many instances across different availability zones and different regions, and that's going to give you an incredible amount of geo redundancy for your application. So if one of those zones goes down, if one of those regions has an outage, if you've scaled up and distributed your load properly across those instances, you may see zero downtime for your users whatsoever. Just a slight degradation in service, a little bit of an increase in lag, but your application keeps running. Once you've chosen your region, you choose an image to launch from. This is called an AMI, an Amazon Machine Image. And just like any virtual machine, it's a pre-built image that starts up your application. We'll talk about it momentarily, but it's got things like your operating system and what's called your root volume configuration. You have images for a whole bunch of different things. Once you've chosen that image, you also need to choose a machine type. And we have a whole nugget about machine type later in this series, but the machine type is essentially the size of the machine, how much CPU and how much RAM you're going to have on your machine. It's important to note that in a typical virtual machine environment, you would choose specifically how much RAM you wanted and how many CPUs you wanted. You don't get to do that here. They have pre-built types that may have 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM or 2 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM, and you have to choose between those two. So you don't have fine-grained control, but they do have a wide variety of different machine types to suit a lot of different workloads. Lastly, once you've done all that, you get to configure all the stuff that goes around your machine. Networking options, storage, security, all the things that make up the environment in which this machine lives. Once you've done these 4 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, that machine will spin up. It'll go into a pending state, and eventually from pending, it'll go into a running state, and then it'll be available. One of the things that happens at the very end here after you choose your configuration options is you get handed back a pair of SSH keys, or if you're using Windows, it's a PEM key for connecting to RDP. Either way, security is paramount in Amazon Web Services, and you need these keys to connect to your virtual machine. It's going to get an IP address, so you know, ... whatever that looks like, and you will use those keys to connect to that IP address either via SSH for Linux instances or via RDP for Windows instances. I'd like to finish by talking briefly about Amazon Machine Images, also known as AMIs. And I mentioned those briefly just a moment ago, but the Amazon Machine Images are what you use to spin up the rest of your instances. So you pick an AMI, and that AMI is essentially cloned, or it's used to configure and build the instance, however many you want. You can use an AMI over and over and over to build as many instances as you want. You can also use AMIs to build different instances. So you may have 3 built from AMI A, and you may have 2 more built from a different AMI completely. At its very basic definition, the AMI configures 2 things: the operating system and what we call the root volume configuration. This is where the root volume is going to be stored and run from. I'll mention briefly what that means in a moment here, and then actually in a later nugget we're going to cover that more in depth. So setting up images from an AMI, really you're choosing the basic configuration for your virtual machine, and that basic configuration is primarily going to be, the operating system. Amazon has a whole number of built-in operating systems in their public AMI repository. I've got a small sample here. You can see CentOS, Debian, Fedora, something called Amazon Linux, Ubuntu, Windows, right on down the line. So they have a public repository of images that are pre-built with all of these operating systems, pre-configured, pre-installed, ready to go and spin up and use right away. There are thousands of images in this repository, and there's not only the public repository, there are also private images in a private repository. So you can look at the images that other users have created for specific cases, for specific tasks. And in some instances, that's actually a marketplace. You can spend money, you can buy those images from other people, or you can build your own image and upload them into the marketplace and sell them to other people. If you're not interested in paying money for images, there are literally thousands of free images as well out inside of this marketplace. Now, the second thing that an image absolutely has to include is the root volume config, which is either EBS backed or instance backed. I'll get into this more in depth, but EBS backed means that the root volume is stored in Elastic Block Store, a storage as a service that AWS provides. Instance backed images means that the root volume is actually stored on a hard drive that's connected to the host machine that's running this instance. So you think about it, what that means is that instance-backed images are much, much faster. They're also much more restrictive. You have a limit on the size of the root volume. Oh, and by the way, when that machine gets stopped or shut down, that root volume is going to disappear. That's what we call ephemeral. So typically you're going to use EBS-backed, but there are cases for instance-backed being the appropriate way to do it. Also, a neat thing in the AMI marketplace is that you can have many popular software configurations pre-installed on those images. So if you need a Windows Server running SQL Server, yeah, sure, you could build your own. You could also find that image already in the marketplace with all that software pre-installed, pre-configured, and ready to go for you. Well, that concludes this introductory nugget for AWS Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2. Just to recap, EC2 is virtual machines in the cloud. We call this an infrastructure as a service because all of the underlying infrastructure for these virtual machines is completely provided and completely fully managed for us by Amazon. We get to take advantage of Amazon's awesome data center network all over the globe to deploy our virtual machines. Pricing for EC2 instances is pay as you go, so we only pay hourly for the instances that are up and running that we actually need and we actually need to use. And these machines are configured by something called AMIs, Amazon Machine Images, which include a whole marketplace of different pre-configured images that we can take advantage of, both free as well as paid images. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.